water bubbles like molten copper in the April sun. Steam rises from the iron cauldron, carrying with it the stench of fear and the promise of agony. A man's voice cuts through the crowd's murmur, not yet screaming but already broken. "Please, I meant no harm, it was but a jest. But jests don't kill beggars, and kings don't forgive. 3 times they will lower him into that boiling hell. 3 times his flesh will cook like meat in a pot. And when it's over, England will have witnessed something new. A law written in steam and suffering, crafted by a king who feared poison more than God himself." This is the story of Richard Roos, a cook who stirred the wrong pot, a man who became the first victim of a punishment so brutal that even executioners would shudder. But was he guilty of murder, or merely guilty of serving the wrong master at the wrong time? April 5th. The morning mist clings to the cobblestones of Smithfield like a shroud. It's barely past dawn, yet already the crowds are gathering. Merchants hawk their wares, bread, ale, roasted nuts, as if this were any other market day. But today Smithfield will witness something England has never seen before. In the center of the square, workers tend to a massive iron cauldron, its black surface gleaming like a beetle's shell. Beneath it, flames dance hungrily, licking at the metal with orange tongues. The water inside begins to simmer, then bubble, then roil with murderous intent. Steam rises in ghostly spirals, carrying with it the metallic scent of heated iron and the promise of unimaginable pain. This is April 5th, 1531. King Henry VIII sits on the throne of England, his marriage to Catherine of Aragon crumbling, his obsession with Anne Boleyn consuming him like fire. Rome opposes him, his own bishops defy him, enemies lurk in every shadow, poison in every cup, betrayal in every smile, and so the king has invented a new law, a new punishment, a new way to make his subjects scream. The man who will die today is Richard Roos, a cook, nothing more. He stirred soup in a bishop's kitchen, served meals to holy men, lived the quiet life of a servant, yet somehow this simple cook has become the center of a royal storm that will reshape English law forever. But this is not just the story of one man's death. This is the story of how paranoia becomes policy, how fear writes legislation in blood, and how a king's terror can boil over into the most brutal form of justice England has ever known. The crowds grow thicker. Children perch on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. Women clutch their shawls against the morning chill. The cauldron bubbles louder now, its voice a constant menacing whisper. Soon Richard Roos will arrive. Soon the screaming will begin. And when it's over, England will have crossed a line from which there can be no return. The water waits, the law waits, history waits, and somewhere in the Tower of London, a king who fears poison more than God himself watches from his window, knowing that today justice will be served, one boiling cup at a time. Richard Roos had calloused hands, the kind that come from years of kneading dough, stirring pots, and serving others. In the grand scheme of Tudor England, he was nobody. A cook in the household of John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, a man who lived in the shadows of great events, stirring soup while kings and bishops reshaped the world above his head. But in 1531, being nobody was dangerous, and working for Bishop Fisher, that was practically a death sentence. Fisher was no ordinary bishop. He was a man of principle in an age when principles could kill you. While King Henry VIII raged against Rome, demanding his marriage to Catherine of Aragon be annulled so he could wed the bewitching Anne Boleyn, Fisher stood firm. "What God has joined," the bishop declared, "let no man put asunder." Noble words, fatal words. The king's fury was a living thing, fed by obsession and paranoia. Every morning brought new reports of opposition. Cardinals in Rome plotted against him. His own parliament hesitated to support him. And Fisher, that stubborn, righteous Fisher, publicly opposed the divorce that would give Henry his heart's desire. In the bishop's household on Rochester Place, London, Richard Roos went about his daily tasks, unaware that he was cooking in the eye of a political hurricane. The kitchen was his domain, a world of bubbling pots, hanging herbs, and the eternal dance of fire and food. Here, among the copper kettles and wooden spoons, Roos had found his place in life. He was good at what he did, trusted, reliable, but Bishop Fisher was not a trusting man anymore. How could he be? The king's agents watched his every move. His letters were intercepted. His friends grew distant, fearing guilt by association. At night, Fisher would pace his chambers, starting at every creak of the floorboards, every scratch at the window. He changed his sleeping quarters frequently, never staying in the same room 2 nights running. He tasted his food carefully, watching for the telltale signs of poison, the bitter aftertaste, the burning sensation, the sudden cramps that meant death was stirring in his belly. The bishop had good reason to fear. Poison was the weapon of choice for those who moved in the shadows of power. A pinch of arsenic in the wine, a sprinkle of mercury in the meat. It was silent, subtle, and left little evidence, perfect for removing inconvenient opponents without the messy business of public executions. February 18, 1531. A Tuesday, the kitchen bustled with its usual energy as Roos prepared the evening meal. The bishop was expecting guests, fellow clergymen who shared his opposition to the king's great matter. The conversation would be dangerous tonight, filled with whispered fears and careful words. Fisher needed sustenance for the battle ahead. Roos stirred the soup, a hearty broth meant to warm the belly and strengthen resolve. Steam rose from the pot, carrying the rich aroma of meat and herbs. It was then, in that moment between stirring and serving, that Richard Roos made the decision that would define the rest of his short, agonizing life. Later, under torture, he would claim it was a jest, a prank. He had added something to the soup, not poison, he swore, but a purgative, something to give the bishop and his guests a touch of discomfort, a bout of loose bowels that would embarrass them and provide a moment's cruel amusement for a cook tired of serving his betters. But jests have consequences, and this jest would kill. The soup was served. The bishop and his guests ate sparingly, their minds on weightier matters than food. But there were others in the household that night, servants, beggars who had come to the kitchen door seeking charity. They ate heartily of the soup, grateful for the warmth and flavor. Within hours, the screaming began. 2 beggars died in convulsions, their bodies racked with agony as whatever Roos had added to the soup burned through their systems like liquid fire. They vomited blood. They writhed on the kitchen floor, clawing at their throats as if trying to tear out the poison that was killing them from within. Their eyes rolled back, showing only white, as their souls fled their tortured bodies. The bishop and his guests survived, having eaten less of the tainted broth, but they were violently ill, purging themselves in ways that left them weak and shaken. Fisher himself barely escaped death, his aged body racked by the mysterious substance that had turned a simple meal into a weapon. The authorities came at dawn. Richard Roos was dragged from his bed, still in his nightshirt, still protesting his innocence. It was but a jest, he cried as the chains were locked around his wrists. I meant no murder. I swear it on Christ's blood. But the dead beggars could not hear his protestations, and in the Tower of London, King Henry VIII was already sharpening this tragedy into a weapon that would serve his greater purpose. The cook who had stirred one pot too many was about to find himself in far hotter water than he had ever imagined. In the Tower of London, King Henry VIII paced his chambers like a caged beast. The news from Bishop Fisher's household had reached him within hours. Poison in the soup, dead beggars, a cook in chains. To most men, this would have been a tragic accident, a servant's prank gone horribly wrong. But Henry was not most men. He was a king consumed by fear, and fear makes monsters of even the mightiest rulers. Every shadow held an assassin. Every meal might be his last. Every cup of wine could contain the bitter kiss of death. The king had grown obsessed with poison, that invisible killer that could strike down even the most powerful monarch. Italian nobles fell to it. French courtiers died choking on their own blood. And now it had come to England, creeping into the very household of his greatest clerical opponent. Henry's mind, already twisted by paranoia and political pressure, seized upon Richard Roos's crime like a drowning man grasps a rope. This wasn't just murder. This was an opportunity, a chance to send a message so brutal, so terrifying that no one would dare raise a poisoned cup against the crown ever again. The king's advisors watched nervously as their master's eyes gleamed with terrible inspiration. Thomas Cromwell, that calculating lawyer who had wormed his way into royal favor, understood immediately what his sovereign was planning. This was politics disguised as justice, fear masquerading as law. Summon Parliament, Henry commanded, his voice carrying the authority of divine right and mortal terror. I would speak to them myself. It was unprecedented. Kings did not appear before Parliament to discuss common criminals. But these were not common times, and Richard Roos would not be treated as a common murderer. He was about to become something far more valuable, a symbol of royal power written in flesh and flame. The halls of Parliament buzzed with nervous energy as word spread that the king himself would address them. Members shuffled their feet and whispered among themselves, wondering what new demand their volatile monarch would make. Would he ask for more money for his wars, more support for his divorce, more laws to crush his enemies? They could never have imagined the truth. Henry strode into the chamber like an avenging angel, his massive frame filling the doorway, his small eyes scanning the assembled nobles and commoners with predatory intensity. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority and barely controlled rage. "My lords," he began, "poison has reared its serpent's head in our realm. A common cook, has dared to season his master's food with death itself. 2 innocent souls have perished, writhing in agony as their bellies burned with borrowed hellfire. This cannot stand, will not stand." The Parliament sat in stunned silence as their king painted Richard Roos's crime in the darkest possible colors. "This was not mere murder," Henry declared. "This was treason of the highest order, an attack upon the very foundations of English society. If a servant could poison his master's table, what safety could any lord claim? What security could even the crown enjoy? Therefore," the king continued, his voice rising like thunder, "let it be known that poisoning shall henceforth be deemed high treason against the realm, and let the punishment fit the magnitude of the crime." The proposed penalty struck the assembly like a physical blow. Death by boiling. The criminal would be lowered alive into a cauldron of bubbling water, cooked like meat until life fled his tormented body. It was a punishment borrowed from the darkest corners of history, refined and perfected for an age that prided itself on civilization. Some Parliament members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was savagery dressed in legal robes, barbarism sanctified by royal decree. But who would dare oppose the king's will? Who would risk being branded a supporter of poisoners and murderers? The law passed with shameful swiftness. The Act of Attainder against Richard Roos sailed through both houses like a ship before a hurricane. The king's will became England's law, and England's law became a weapon of terror. But whispers followed in the legislation's wake. In taverns and noble houses, in markets and monasteries, people asked the questions that dared not be spoken in Parliament's halls. Was Richard Roos truly guilty of intentional murder? Or had he become a convenient scapegoat for a king's paranoid fantasies? Some pointed fingers at the Boleyn family, that ambitious clan that had captured the king's heart and poisoned his mind against his lawful wife. Anne Boleyn's relatives had much to gain from Bishop Fisher's downfall. What if they had orchestrated the entire affair, using a simple cook as their unwitting weapon? What if Roos's jest had been guided by more cunning hands? Others suggested that Henry himself had manufactured the crisis, seizing upon a kitchen accident and transforming it into political theater. The king needed enemies to justify his increasingly tyrannical behavior. Dead beggars and a terrified cook served his purposes perfectly. The truth became lost in the maze of royal politics and courtly intrigue. Perhaps Roos was a murderer. Perhaps he was a pawn. Perhaps he was simply an unlucky man who had stirred the wrong pot at the wrong time. In the end, it didn't matter. The king had spoken. The law had been written. The cauldron was being prepared. As winter melted into spring, workmen labored in Smithfield, constructing the instruments of Roos's doom. The iron cauldron was tested, its heating mechanisms perfected. Guards rehearsed the grisly choreography of judicial boiling. Executioners consulted ancient texts, seeking guidance for a punishment that predated memory. And in his cell, Richard Roos waited, perhaps still believing that mercy might yet intervene, that someone would speak for a simple cook caught in the web of kings and bishops. He could not have known that his death had already been decided, not by justice but by a monarch's fear and a parliament's cowardice. The flames were being kindled, the water was beginning to heat, and England was about to witness the birth of a new kind of nightmare, one sanctified by law and blessed by royal decree. April 5, 1531. Dawn breaks over Smithfield with the pale light of Judgment Day. The great market square, usually filled with the cheerful chaos of commerce, has been transformed into an amphitheater of horror. Wooden barriers hold back the growing crowd, while guards in royal livery stand at attention, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they are about to witness. The cauldron dominates the square like a malevolent altar. 8 feet across, crafted from the finest iron, it squats over a carefully constructed fire pit. Beneath its black belly, flames dance with hungry enthusiasm, fed by seasoned oak that burns hot and steady. The water within has been heating since before sunrise, and now it bubbles with murderous intent, steam rising in ghostly columns that twist and dissipate in the morning air. The crowd gathers like vultures drawn to carrion. Nobles arrive in silk and velvet, taking their places on specially constructed viewing platforms. Merchants and tradesmen jostle for position behind the barriers. Mothers lift children onto their shoulders for a better view, as if this were some grand festival rather than the birth of a new form of legal murder. Street vendors work the crowd, their voices cutting through the murmur of anticipation. Hot pies, fresh bread, ale to wash away the screams. They hawk their wares with the casual efficiency of those who have learned to profit from human misery. This is spectacle after all, entertainment for the masses, a day out for the whole family. The church bells of London toll 9 times as the procession approaches Smithfield. First come the guards, their boots striking the cobblestones in perfect rhythm. Behind them walks the Sheriff of London, bearing the royal warrant that will transform a man into meat. And finally, flanked by more guards, comes Richard Roos himself. The cook who once stirred soup now stumbles toward his own final recipe. Weeks in the Tower have reduced him to a shadow of his former self. His hair hangs lank and greasy around a face hollowed by fear and starvation. His clothes, the rough brown wool of a condemned man, hang loose on his shrunken frame. But it is his eyes that tell the true story of his torment. They dart constantly, searching the crowd for some sign of mercy, some face that might offer salvation. They find none. The crowd's murmur rises to a roar as Roos is led to the cauldron. Some jeer and curse him as a murderer. Others call out prayers for his soul. Children point and stare with the cruel fascination that only the young possess. This is history in the making, and they are all witnesses to it. The sheriff reads the warrant in a voice that carries across the square. The words are formal, laden with the weight of legal authority, but their meaning is simple. Richard Roos has been judged guilty of high treason by poisoning, and he will die by being boiled alive until dead. The crowd falls silent as the pronouncement echoes off the surrounding buildings. The executioners approach their victim with the mechanical precision of men who have trained for this moment. They strip Roos of his clothes, leaving him naked and shivering in the April air. His body, once strong from years of kitchen labor, now shows the marks of imprisonment. Ribs visible beneath pale skin, muscles wasted by confinement and terror. A rope is secured around Roos's chest, running through a pulley system that will allow his tormentors to control his descent into hell. The cook looks up at the sky one final time, perhaps seeking some sign from the God he served faithfully in Bishop Fisher's household. The heavens offer no comfort, only the pale indifference of an overcast morning. The first immersion begins at precisely 10 o'clock. The executioners lower Roos slowly, his feet entering the boiling water first. The reaction is immediate and horrific. His flesh begins to cook instantly, the skin turning red, then white, then peeling away in ribbons that float in the bubbling cauldron like obscene delicacies. His screams tear through the morning air, not human sounds anymore, but the raw vocalization of pure agony. The crowd reacts with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Some lean forward for a better view, others turn away, unable to stomach the reality of what their entertainment demands. Women faint, strong men vomit, children begin to cry, finally understanding that this is not a game but genuine torture beyond their worst nightmares. Roos is lifted from the cauldron after what feels like an eternity but is probably only minutes. Steam rises from his cooked flesh, and the smell of boiled meat fills the square, a smell that will haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. The cook is still alive, still conscious, his eyes wide with shock and pain that no human language can adequately describe. The second descent goes deeper. This time the water reaches his waist, and the screams become even more inhuman. The crowd can see his flesh literally cooking, the fat beneath the skin bubbling and melting. The water in the cauldron turns red with blood and other fluids that pour from his disintegrating body. When he is lifted again, Richard Roos barely resembles a human being. His lower body has been transformed into something that belongs on a butcher's table rather than in the realm of the living. Yet still he breathes, still he suffers, still he endures an agony that hell itself could not improve upon. The third and final immersion is total. Roos disappears entirely beneath the surface of the boiling water, and for a moment the crowd falls silent, waiting. Then the bubbles begin, not just from the fire below, but from the body itself as the last air escapes from his lungs. The water churns and froths as Richard Roos completes his transformation from man to meat. When they finally pull him from the cauldron for the last time, he is dead. What remains is no longer recognizably human, just cooked flesh falling from bones, a grotesque parody of a Sunday roast. The smell of death and rendered fat hangs over Smithfield like a curse. The crowd disperses slowly, many of them walking in stunned silence. They have witnessed something unprecedented in English history, the birth of a new form of judicial murder that will be remembered long after kings and bishops are forgotten. As they return to their homes and shops, they carry with them the memory of Richard Roos's screams, the sight of his flesh peeling away, the smell of human meat cooking in royal justice. The cauldron is left to cool, its iron surface stained with blood and grease. By evening it will be cleaned and stored away, ready for the next soul unfortunate enough to fall afoul of England's new law. For this is only the beginning. Other poisoners will follow, other cauldrons will bubble, other screams will tear through the London air. Richard Roos is dead, but his legacy lives on in the most terrible way possible, as the first victim of a punishment so brutal that it defies human comprehension. The cook who stirred soup has become the main course in a feast of royal vengeance that will poison English justice for years to come. The cauldron had done its work, but Henry VIII's appetite for blood had only just begun to feed. Richard Roos's boiled corpse was barely cold when the machinery of royal justice started grinding toward its next victims. The king had tasted the intoxicating power of absolute terror, and like any addict, he craved more. Within months, another soul would meet the same fate. Margaret Davy, a servant accused of poisoning her household, found herself staring into the same bubbling hell that had claimed Roos, the same cauldron, the same screams, the same horrified crowds gathering to witness what England had become under its increasingly unstable monarch. The law Henry had crafted in paranoia was proving its worth as an instrument of state terror, but the true irony of Roos's death lay not in its immediate aftermath, but in the fate that awaited those who had orchestrated his destruction. The king, who feared poison above all else, would discover that his greatest enemies required no arsenic or mercury to destroy him. They would use his own paranoia as their weapon. Bishop John Fisher, the man whose household had been the scene of Roos's alleged crime, would not escape the king's wrath for long. Despite surviving the poisoned soup, Fisher's opposition to Henry's divorce sealed his doom more surely than any toxin ever could. In 1535, just 4 years after watching his cook boil alive, Fisher himself would meet the headsman's axe on Tower Hill. His crime? Refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the English Church. His severed head was displayed on London Bridge for weeks, a grisly reminder that in Tudor England, principle was more deadly than poison. Anne Boleyn, the woman whose bewitching beauty had driven Henry to reshape English law and religion, would discover that royal love was as fickle as royal justice. The same king who had moved heaven and earth to make her his queen would grow tired of her failure to produce a male heir. By 1536, Anne found herself in the Tower of London, accused of adultery, incest, and treason. The irony was exquisite. The woman who may have benefited from Roos's frame-up would herself become the victim of fabricated charges. Unlike the cook, however, Anne's noble blood earned her the mercy of a swift beheading rather than the slow agony of boiling water. And what of Henry himself? The king, who had invented new forms of legal murder in his paranoid quest for security, would find that no amount of blood could wash away his fears. As the years passed, his body swelled with disease, and his mind twisted with suspicion. He would marry 4 more times, executing 2 more wives in his endless search for the perfect queen and the male heir that haunted his dreams. His legs, rotted with infection, would eventually confine him to his chambers, where he would rage against enemies both real and imagined, until death finally claimed him in 1547. Throughout the remainder of the Tudor period, the cauldrons would bubble whenever poisoners were caught. The punishment was applied with mechanical efficiency, each execution following the template established by Richard Roos's death. Men and women would scream as their flesh cooked, their agony serving as both entertainment and education for crowds that never seemed to tire of the spectacle. But even the most brutal laws eventually faced their reckoning with conscience. As England evolved from a medieval kingdom into a more modern state, voices began to question whether boiling criminals alive served any purpose beyond satisfying the bloodthirsty appetite of mobs and monarchs. The punishment was gradually used less frequently, reserved for only the most heinous cases of poisoning. The end came quietly, almost apologetically, during the reign of Elizabeth I. The queen, who prided herself on being more civilized than her father, quietly allowed the boiling law to fall into disuse. No grand proclamation marked its abolition. It simply faded away like steam from a cooling cauldron. The last judicial boiling in England occurred in 1542, a full decade before Richard Roos's death, marking the end of one of history's most barbaric legal punishments. Today, Smithfield bears no trace of the horrors it once witnessed. The ancient market square has been transformed into a bustling district of shops, restaurants, and offices. Londoners hurry across the same cobblestones where crowds once gathered to watch their fellow citizens cook alive, oblivious to the screams that once echoed off these walls. A few historical plaques mention the area's connection to medieval executions, but none specifically commemorate Richard Roos or the other victims of judicial boiling. The site where the cauldron once stood is now occupied by a coffee shop, its customers sipping lattes while sitting mere feet from where human flesh once bubbled in royal justice. The irony would have amused Roos, perhaps, a cook's final resting place marked by the aroma of brewing beverages rather than boiling bodies. Yet the legacy of Richard Roos extends far beyond the physical geography of his death. His case represents a crucial moment in the evolution of English law, when royal paranoia was allowed to override centuries of legal precedent and basic human decency. The speed with which Parliament rushed to approve Henry's Boiling Law demonstrated how easily fear can corrupt justice, how quickly civilized societies can embrace barbarism when their leaders demand it. Legal scholars still study Roos's case as an example of how retroactive legislation can be used to persecute individuals for crimes that weren't crimes when they were committed. Henry's decision to make poisoning high treason after Roos's alleged offense violated fundamental principles of jurisprudence that remain sacred today. In this sense, the dead cook became an unwitting martyr for the rule of law, his boiled corpse a testament to what happens when power is allowed to operate without restraint. The question of Roos's actual guilt remains unanswered, lost in the maze of Tudor politics and royal propaganda. Was he truly a murderer who deserved punishment, if not the extreme agony he endured? Or was he an innocent man sacrificed on the altar of Henry's paranoid ambitions? The historical record offers no definitive answer, only the certainty that whatever his crime, the punishment exceeded all bounds of human decency. Perhaps that uncertainty is itself part of Roos's legacy. In an age when we take due process and proportional punishment for granted, his story reminds us how fragile these protections truly are, how easily they can be swept away by fear, how quickly justice can transform into vengeance when those in power feel threatened. The cauldron is gone, but the lessons it taught remain. In every courtroom where defendants receive fair trials, in every legislature that debates the limits of state power, in every constitution that protects citizens from cruel and unusual punishment, Richard Roos's ghost whispers its warning. Remember what happens when fear writes the law in blood. Walk through Smithfield today and you'll hear the sounds of modern London, car horns blaring, tourists chattering, baristas calling out orders in trendy cafes. But if you listen closely, if you let your imagination pierce the veil of centuries, you might hear something else carried on the wind, a sound that no amount of progress can completely silence, the echo of screams. They say that violence leaves stains on the world, invisible marks that time cannot wash away, in the stones beneath your feet, in the air that fills your lungs, in the very soil that supports the glass towers and designer boutiques. The memory of Richard Roos lingers like smoke from an extinguished fire. He was a cook who became a meal, a servant who became a symbol, a man who became a warning written in flesh and pain for all the world to read. His crime, real or imagined, has long since faded into historical obscurity, but his punishment, that endures, that teaches, that reminds us what we are capable of when fear conquers reason and power devours mercy. The king who killed him died in agony, his body rotting from within as surely as if he had been poisoned by his own paranoia. The bishop whose household spawned the tragedy lost his head to the same royal fury that had claimed his cook. The woman who may have orchestrated the entire affair found herself under the headsman's axe, discovering too late that those who live by conspiracy often die by it. But Richard Roos? He achieved a kind of immortality that his persecutors could never have imagined. Not the golden immortality of heroes and saints, but the dark eternal life of cautionary tales and historical warnings. His name is spoken in law schools and history classrooms, his story retold whenever scholars discuss the dangers of unchecked power. The man who stirred soup became the ingredient in a recipe for justice that no civilized society should ever cook again. And in that transformation from human being to historical lesson, perhaps he found the only redemption possible for someone who died so far from grace. Listen, can you hear it? Beyond the noise of the modern world, beyond the comfortable sounds of progress and civilization, there's still that echo, still that reminder of what we've done and what we're capable of doing again if we forget the lessons written in steam and screams centuries ago. The cook is gone, the cauldron is cold, but the echo remains, waiting for those wise enough to listen to its terrible truth. The story of Richard Roos is more than just a tale of Tudor brutality. It's a mirror held up to the darkest corners of human nature. It shows us what happens when fear becomes policy, when paranoia becomes law, when the powerful decide that some people are more disposable than others. If this story has left you shaken, if it's made you question how thin the line really is between civilization and savagery, then it has done its job. History's most important function isn't to comfort us with tales of progress, but to warn us with examples of how quickly that progress can be undone. Richard Roos died screaming in a cauldron of boiling water, but his voice still echoes across the centuries, asking us the same question that haunts every generation. What are you willing to do in the name of justice? And when you have your answer, ask yourself this: how different is that answer from the one King Henry VIII gave on that April morning in 15th? The darkness that consumed Tudor England hasn't disappeared. It's simply waiting for the right combination of fear, power, and silence to emerge again. The only defense against it is remembering stories like this one, no matter how much they disturb our sleep. If you found yourself unable to look away from this tale of historical horror, if you want to explore more of the shadows that lurk in humanity's past, then subscribe to our channel, because the darkness of history has many stories to tell, and someone needs to bear witness to them all. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and prepare yourself for more journeys into the places where civilization ends and nightmare begins. The past is full of screams waiting to be heard, and we'll make sure they never fall silent. Until next time, remember, the cauldron may be cold, but the lessons it taught are still burning hot.